I'm joined by Ryan Spain from the Peoria area. Ryan's the 73rd District. And our newest House Republican member, Jackie Haas from the 79th District, Kankakee. She was recently sworn in to take the place of Lindsay Parkhurst, now Judge Parkhurst. So Jackie, thanks for joining us today. Today we're talking about fair maps, once again, an issue that you've heard us talk about a lot, but obviously with this being the redistricting year following the census, it's paramount that we have a process in place that creates fair and equitable legislative maps across the state of Illinois. And just a little bit of background on how redistricting works. Every 10 years following the decennial federal census, states receive data from the federal government that then allows us to turn around and do innumerable things. But one of the things that we do with that data is to create new legislative boundaries based off population shifts. So here in Illinois, we will get that data from the federal government sometime, hopefully in the next few weeks. And then we will then draw the maps, the 118 House maps, the 59 Senate maps get redrawn to reflect the population shifts to have an equal number of citizens in those legislative districts. So we will do that this year. It's a process that it has continually been done by the legislature. Per the Constitution, the legislature by law shall redistrict the legislative districts in Illinois. And that's the key phrase to talk about today, is that the Constitution makes it the responsibility of the legislature by law. And what we're here today is introduce legislation that would basically take Leader Durkin's constitutional amendment that he's had out there for a few years. That's very similar to the 2016 constitutional amendment that we tried very hard that 563 Illinoisans signed petitions to get on the ballot. This is very similar to that, and we're, instead of doing it through constitutional amendment, that by law provision in the Constitution for the legislature allows us to pass statute to set up a bipartisan, nonpartisan commission to enact fair maps in Illinois if the legislature would so choose. We have the ability to set up a commission, take it directly out of the legislature's hands on drawing the maps and give it over to a commission. And that's what I think we should do. And that's obviously what the people here today think we should be doing as well. So basically what this commission would do would be 11-person commission. People would submit their names. There's in the legislation, there's some guidelines as to, you have to be a resident of the state for 4 years, registered voter, things like that. The Auditor General would take those people, those submissions, and we would come up with a pool of 100 potential commissioners on the commission. And then there would be a blind draw for 7 of those commissioners, and the other 4 commissioners would be appointments from each of the 4 legislative leaders in the General Assembly out of the remaining pool of applicants. It's a pretty straightforward process with that. And then that commission would be tasked with coming up with the maps for the new General Assembly. This commission would be open and transparent. The meetings would be public. They'd have to have at least 2 days notice on any public meeting. Public hearings will be held before and after releasing any redistricting plan. All the records of the commission would be public record, including communications between the commissioners. And then the public would have at least 7 days to review the district maps before a final vote of the commission. Now, we are up against a constitutional deadline on this. By the Constitution, we would have to have these maps in place by the end of June, or else the commission as spelled out, the Legislative Redistricting Commission as spelled out in the Constitution would take hold, because this is just statute. But this gives us an opportunity going into veto session to put this on the books, to pass something quickly, to hold the governor to feet to the fire in his promise to enact fair maps, and to hold accountable the other members of the General Assembly, who we have a lot of members of the General Assembly who have signed on for fair maps. Just a reminder, in 2016, the House of Representatives passed a bipartisan redistricting constitutional amendment to put on the ballot with 105 votes in the House. 105 votes, overwhelming vote to put it on the ballot. There are currently 32 Democrats in the Illinois House of Representatives who voted for that piece of legislation in 2016. So there's bipartisan support for this. Unfortunately, that constitutional amendment was killed the next day in the Senate by a subcommittee. And actually the deciding vote in that subcommittee was no less than our current Attorney General, Kwame Raoul, when he was in the Senate, voted no to put it on the ballot. So this is a great way to do it through statute, to make sure that we have a independent commission that draws our maps this year, gets it out of the hands of the leadership of the General Assembly and put it in a commission of citizens to draw fair and equitable maps across the state of Illinois. Next, I'm going to turn it over to, as I said, our newest member of the House Republican Caucus, Jackie Haas from Kankakee. Jackie represents the 79th District. She's got a great background as in social work, and she's one of the great stories that people like we like to hear, that went out of state, went across the border to Valpo to go to school, but she came back to Illinois and is a great citizen of Illinois. So with that, Representative Haas, it's all yours.
Thank you, Representative Butler. As you said, my name is Jackie Haas, and I represent the 79th District, which consists of mostly of Kankakee County, but also includes parts of Grundy and Will counties as well. Fair maps are essential to the residents of my district to ensure that their voices are heard in Springfield. Arbitrarily dividing our villages and townships to snake districts around for partisan gain only serves to lose confidence in our government and drown out the voices of our constituents. For example, gerrymandering in the 79th excludes 3/4 of the city of Momence, which is in the eastern part of Kankakee County. It also includes only 3 streets in the village of Beecher. This disregarding of village and township lines disadvantages the residents of these villages. It's inexplicable that a constituent in Momence can be represented by someone who lives in the area, but someone across the street from them cannot. Unfortunately, this example is not the only case. The 79th District cuts through the village of Piatone. These moves were not based on township, village, or meaningful divisions, but on pure partisan maneuvers to advantage Madigan to keep his majority and his power. In 2018, Governor Pritzker supported fair maps during his campaign. I'm calling on him today to keep his campaign promise. The people of Illinois want fair maps, and it is incumbent on the General Assembly and the governor to deliver that. I'm going to turn it over now to Representative Spain, and he will speak a little bit more on the issue.
Well, thank you very much, Representative Haas. Welcome to the General Assembly. Can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to working with you and all of our colleagues and to work on this important issue of redistricting reform. My name is Ryan Spain. I represent the Central Illinois area in District 73, and I'm broadcasting to you today from my home office, my district office in my hometown of Peoria. So I've been a longtime supporter of fair maps, and like many of us in the state of Illinois, I was one of the nearly 600,000 people that signed a petition in 2014 demanding that we create a new way forward for how we draw our legislative districts in the state of Illinois, and to place that question on the ballot so we could finally give voters a choice of whether they would choose how and be involved with the way that our legislative districts are created, taking the decisions of politicians from drawing our own legislative districts and empowering independent voters for a different way forward. Unfortunately, we know what happened back in 2014. A partisan decision of the Illinois Supreme Court scuttled the efforts and really the commitment of those nearly 600,000 people to make a difference and offer a choice for a different way forward in the state of Illinois. And that decision really still burns me to this day. If you recall, one of the petitioners that brought forward a block on placing that question on the ballot was John Hooker, a ComEd lobbyist who is now under indictment and part of the Speaker Madigan ComEd bribery scheme that we're still in the midst of here in the state of Illinois. And the deciding decision of the Illinois Supreme Court was authored by Tom Kilbride, who has now been removed from the state Supreme Court, but was heavily supported and really brought forward by Speaker Madigan to do work like this, to make sure that the interests of protecting his methodology for controlling the map-making process in the state of Illinois could be continued. So what have we seen since then? Since that time, our situation in the state of Illinois has not gotten any better. Illinois continues to lose population. Many of our lawmakers are elected with little or no opposition throughout the state. And this scourge of corruption, of bad ethical activity, illegal activity by our state lawmakers has only gotten worse. And so now we approach another 10 years, another census, and we're still allowing politicians to draw the legislative districts that they will represent. So something has to change. And since the Supreme Court decision many years ago, I have repeatedly supported and been either the sponsor or the chief co-sponsor of a number of different initiatives to change the way we approach redistricting in the state of Illinois. In this current General Assembly, I've been sponsor or co-sponsor of 2 constitutional amendments. That's House Joint Resolution Constitutional Amendment 10 and also Amendment number 15. And in the previous 100th General Assembly, the 100th General Assembly, it was House Joint Resolution Constitutional Amendment 43. Every time we achieved bipartisan co-sponsors for these measures, but the question was blocked from consideration by Speaker Madigan. So now, having passed the deadline to place, to have made a difference for amending the state constitution, we are seeking another option, and that is through legislation to make the changes necessary to bring some element of independence into the map-making process. And I'm very happy and proud to support either a constitutional amendment or now a legislative change to make the difference here as we approach the remap. This is really important, and the timing of it could not be more urgent. And we're all starting to hear why. Because as Speaker Madigan struggles to sustain his grip on power and seeks to count up 60 votes to support his reelection for Speaker, one of the things that he's trying to do, and is very blatant in his discussion with members, is talking about his ability to create another gerrymandered partisan map and protect incumbent members of his party. That is wrong. That is what we must stand against. And it really is part of the cycle of corruption and poor behavior that we see throughout the legislature coming through Speaker Madigan's office. So I'm here today to support this new way forward. I think it's absolutely critical that we make a change for the future of our state and the future of our legislature. Gerrymandering is a corrupt tool that must be taken away from the toolbox of Speaker Mike Madigan. Now, one last thing. I think it's important, and I applaud and appreciate Governor Pritzker for campaigning on the premise of independent maps and the importance that they reflect for the future of the state of Illinois. So this is an opportunity now for Republicans and Democrats to work together through the leadership of Governor Pritzker to make a difference and get this done in the final days of this current General Assembly. I think this is an example, and we have worked together with the governor before on issues such as infrastructure investments, and this should be another thing. Governor Pritzker campaigned on this important topic. I think he is right on the money for raising it and putting an emphasis on the need for changing how we draw our legislative districts in Illinois. This is the very last chance that we have to do it. We need to do it now before Speaker Madigan is able to leverage gerrymandering as the solution to his ethics problems and his inability to get to 60 votes for re-election as Speaker. With that said, we'll now open it up to questions. So Colleen, what questions do we have?
So our first one here is from Dave Dahl. How fair would maps be if Republicans held the magic marker?
Well, Dave, that's a really good question. I'll take that, and anyone else can jump in. I think the process has to be fair. And to me, this has nothing to do with electing more Republicans to the legislature. And people might chuckle at that, but it really is truly about transforming how our state government works. And right now we have many members that are elected without opposition. They are elected where a primary election is often much more important to them than a general election. And I think we see a pattern in our state where we're not getting things done. We're not making the changes to move our state forward on pension reform, ethics reform, any number of issues. And the reason we're not doing that is because we're not electing members that are actually incentivized to cooperate and work together to affect change for the good of Illinois. So to me, redistricting is not about adding another Republican member to our side of the aisle. It's about having better government solutions. And I think until we do that, we're going to continue to be stuck in a state here that is on the decline.
And I would add that I think the idea that the legislators get to draw the maps, they get to draw the districts that they want, is something that the people I think are just sick and tired of, and that it's far past its time to come up with a better model on how we redistrict and how we draw our boundaries and things like that. The data is out there tremendously on how we can come up with good districts. Some districts might not change very much, some might, but the fact that we allow the legislators to draw their own lines, and it's not just here in Illinois, obviously it's across the country, I think it's something that the people really want to see changed to come up with something that works better than we have today.
All right, our next question is from Rachel Hinton at the Sun-Times. Have you started to talk to your colleagues about this legislation? Do you think it has enough support to pass?
Well, I go back to what I said in my opening remarks. There are 32 Democrats in the House of Representatives today that voted for Representative Frank's constitutional amendment in 2016. 32. You've got, I'm sure, 45 House Republicans or 44 in the lame duck session that would be happy to vote for this. On top of that, you've got a piece of legislation that both Representative Spain and I are co-sponsors on, a bipartisan constitutional amendment by Representative Tara Costa-Howard. And I give her credit for being a real advocate for this. And when you look at that piece of legislation, there's 9 Democrats, Kelly Cassidy, Chris Welch, Mike Zaleski, they're all on that piece of legislation. So I think there's broad bipartisan support. I have had conversations with my colleagues recently, this week, and throughout the years about the fact that we all support going to a commission. And I think this gives us another avenue to go down to do it through statute and honestly lower the threshold that's needed to potentially the vote threshold needed to enact this. And so I think it's a really good avenue to go down. We're going to continue to talk about it. The legislation is drafted. My hope is to get it introduced today, and hopefully it's something that we're going to bring up in the lame duck session.
This is a follow-up question from Dave Dahl. How would you all define fair?
Well, Dave, good question again. And the definition of fairness is the compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. And every proposal that I've been involved in, including this one, makes sure that we adhere to the Federal Voting Rights Act. And the fairness that is comprised of them, it's important to note, reflects that the interests of communities, their geographies is protected, but also the role of racial and ethnic minorities is a key consideration. And so fair doesn't mean that you divide up particular communities, but it does mean that you cannot use as the deciding factor whether someone is registered to be a Republican or a Democrat. We need to be agnostic about those partisan labels as we draw and create these districts. And again, as Representative Leader Butler said, we should not be doing that. We, the legislature, should not be involved in a system that allows us to pick the voters that we would choose to represent. There's nothing fair about that. And there's nothing fair about the way that Speaker Mike Madigan dispatched his loyalists, John Hooker now, his attorney, Mike Casper, and now Tom Kilbride, to make sure that the efforts, the grassroots efforts of people throughout the state of Illinois to call the question on a legitimate different way forward so that we could return to better government for the state of Illinois. It's not fair that he rigged the game and made sure none of us ever had that opportunity.
And I think just to add on to that, you write it in the legislation that you can't use the political data. And so when I look at this legislation, it shall only consider party registration and voting history data to determine what Ryan talked about to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act. You can't use it to draw your boundaries to pack Republicans or Democrats into a particular district to create a district. I use my district as an example all the time. I know my district was created to pack Republicans into it so you could potentially create 2 Democrat districts, one on the south end and one on the north end. Sue Shear's district was created to create a Democrat where Republicans were before. Mike Eunice's district was created to try to get a Democrat elected there as well, and we've succeeded in holding that seat. You shouldn't use that data when you're drawing the maps. That's just plain wrong to be able to use the political data when you're drawing these maps.
Our next question is a follow-up from the Sun-Times. Has this been introduced yet? If not, when will it be introduced?
Yeah, I mentioned that it's drafted, and my hope is to get it introduced today.
Okay, this is our last question from Mike Militich with Quincy Media. You mentioned bipartisan support for previous plans to make fair maps. Do you feel there's more of a chance to pass it this year with 19 Democrats distancing themselves from Speaker Madigan?
I'll start. I certainly hope so. I think that the spirit of bipartisanship can be reignited in the state of Illinois. And so you have currently at least 19 members of the Democratic caucus that are interested in a different way forward. Many of them are co-sponsors for previous efforts that we have introduced and that they have introduced. So I am hopeful, and I think this needs to be a part of the discussion. I think it needs to be an urgent front runner of the many different issues that we'll consider in the coming days as we finish this session of the General Assembly. This needs to be a leading item of discussion because we've got to embrace the opportunities to make, finally, after 50 years, a much needed change in the state of Illinois.
All right, thank you. That's all the questions we have. So if anyone has any follow-up, they can reach out to me. Thanks, everyone.